This act may be cited as the Blowout Prevention Act of 2010.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment. Chair recognizes himself. We have a manager's amendment that is in the process of being typed. And in order to expedite matters, if members would be willing by unanimous consent to have it considered as read, as it's being written.
Yeah.
It would.
We are, with the gentleman would yield.
Yes.
Based on the good faith that's been exhibited on both sides and the understanding that we all have on what's in the manager's amendment, I see no objection to that. Reserving the right, though, that we actually clarify before we vote on it that it.
We're not voting on it until we have the draft.
Is what was verbally agreed to.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman?
Are you reserving a right to object?
Yes.
Yes, generally is recognized on the reservation.
I think the process is fine, but since I am keenly interested in one issue which may or may not be in the manager's amendment, I'm seeking guidance on what I should do.
You would offer an amendment.
Fine. So I will then, your guidance is I should offer an amendment, and hopefully that amendment will be adopted and included in the manager's amendment as finally typed. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think it would be put in the bill.
Fine.
We'll recognize you at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw my objection.
Without objection, then, the reading of the manager's amendment is considered accepted. Now, under the rules under which we are informally operating, we will be pleased to recognize. A number of members have filed an amendments, and I'm at this point prepared to recognize them. The amendments would be made to the manager's amendment, and if they're not drafted in that way, we will, by unanimous consent, consider them drafted to the manager's amendments for consideration. Amendments, I must tell my colleagues that amendments that are not agreed to by Mr. Barton and myself will elicit our opposition. We are now trying to review the amendments on both sides and see what can be agreed to, but we can start talking about some of these amendments, and then we'll decide before the conclusion of the debate the recommendations that we would make to our colleagues. Of course, our colleagues can vote as they wish. So the chair asks if there are amendments that are ready to be offered. Mr. Stupak, you have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have two amendments. First one is 136, Amendment 136, Oil Spill Preparedness Amendment.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5626 offered by Mr. Stupak of Michigan. Page 11, after line 24, insert the following new section and make the necessary conforming changes. Section 6.
I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, that'll be the order. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take full 5 minutes, but during our hearings, especially the June 15th hearing that we held with the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, we looked into the oil response plans by the 5 major oil companies, which were nearly carbon copy of the oil response plan drafted by BP. Each of these 5 response plans from the oil companies include a section on responding to worst-case scenario involving an offshore exploratory well. BP's plan stated it can handle up to 250,000 barrels per day. Chevron and Shell stated they can handle up to 200,000 barrels per day. Exxon stated it can handle a spill of over 150,000 barrels per day. These plans include options executed by BP that failed, such as the top kill and junk shot. It was clear from the response on Deepwater Horizon spill that the plans were created by the oil companies are not realistic and are not sufficient to address the worst-case scenario the Gulf Coast is currently experiencing. In fact, the CEOs on their oath said that they couldn't handle a spill as big as they claimed they could because they do not have the resources. Well, it's been 87 days since the Deepwater Horizon explosion, and BP has not yet established a successful cap to the well. We'll hope the latest one, we'll hope it works, but so far it hasn't been successful. In that time, BP has not been prepared to commit sufficient equipment to contain and clean up the oil and did not have adequate plans in place to do so. This points to a need for regulators to require oil spill response plans that adequately prevent environmental damage as soon as they occur. My amendment would require oil companies to deploy at least 60% of the equipment, personnel, and other materials listed in its worst-case scenario oil response plan to a spill site within 12 hours of a spill. Without this requirement, the most carefully drafted plans enforced by federal regulators would not guarantee a spill could be contained in time before invoking devastating circumstances on our environment. This amendment holds the oil companies accountable for their response plans. I urge the adoption. They all claim they could handle so many barrels. Let's make sure they pre-deploy some of this stuff so we do not have the environmental damage we have now. I ask for support of the amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Texas seeks recognition.
In
5 minutes.
In opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Subcommittee Chairman Stupak's intent in this amendment is certainly laudable. Having said that, it's, in my opinion, too prescriptive. The requirement of 60% of the equipment is, while again laudable and it's over half, it may or may not be the amount of material that needs to be necessary. In the base bill, we now have, if this becomes law, there would be a requirement that the oil response plan be in place, and then it be able to promptly control and stop the blowout, and that in the event of the necessity of a relief well, such relief well needs to begin as expeditiously as possible. So what we've put into the base bill are common sense requirements where best faith efforts would be made and required to be made. In my opinion, Mr. Chairman, to go as far as the Stupak amendment does, when it begins to be prescriptive into the certain percentages, you get into a debate very quickly about 60% of what. Is 60% necessary, or maybe it should be 2/3, maybe you only need 45%. So again, we have no problem with the amendment's intent, but in effect, it would probably hurt more than harm, would probably result in redundant equipment being positioned at unnecessary cost, and it wouldn't be necessary. So we would oppose the amendment.
Would gentlemen yield on that point?
Sure.
You know, as we've shown in our hearings, whether it was the oversight investigations or the Energy and Environment Subcommittee when doing these hearings, these oil companies, they don't own the response equipment.
That's true.
Whether you're Shell, Exxon, BP, you give it to a company called O'Brien, and they're supposed to pre-deploy. In fact, they're an oil response, I forget the last part of the team or whatever, all the oil companies chip into it. So when you have a spill like this, BP says, well, we don't have it. We hire these other guys to do it. These other guys aren't doing their job. That's sort of what we're getting. Someone has to be held accountable. So if all the oil companies who are drilling in the Gulf, why can't we have 60% of your worst case scenario? They all estimate a worst case scenario. You should be able to say, okay, O'Brien, I believe that's the company, you're responsible to respond to the spill. You got to have 60%. And it's not just for one well, but I mean, that can be for all. An hour out where Deep Horizon is by airplane, it's what, 45 minutes to an hour. So, I mean, I think the length of time, and since the oil companies always sort of shift the responsibility to somebody else, we have to put a requirement in there to keep someone responsible. You have this third party who does it. Let's make sure that at least 60% of the materials are there to handle a spill.
If I could reclaim my time,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman. First of all, the gentleman from Michigan is exactly correct. As a result of the Exxon Valdez, there was a special corporation set up where The oil companies all did submit or commit basic amounts of money into a fund that was then used to buy and pre-position equipment all over the country. It has been shown in this accident that some of that equipment was obsolete. The technology has not been developed further. And it's also been shown that certain federal agencies didn't allow equipment that wasn't pre-positioned in the Gulf to be moved to the Gulf to help in the spill, which to me seems somewhat ironical. Having said that, the gentleman is absolutely correct to point out some of the flaws of the current pre-positioning requirements. It's something his subcommittee should look at, in the full committee. But in terms of this particular bill, you have got, if it does become law, and I hope it does become law, much more specific requirements in terms of the plans being realistic, the equipment being as up to date as possible, certification by third parties, which the gentleman referred to. You simply don't want to go too far and become too prescriptive and actually do more harm than good. And at least in the opinion of this member, this Stupak amendment in its current form, one, is not necessary while well-intentioned, and number two, is too prescriptive. So I respect the gentleman, but I do continue to oppose it.
Is there further discussion of the amendment? For the benefit of the gentleman from Michigan, I see a lot of wisdom in your amendment, but we are operating on an informal understanding that both have to agree to the amendment. We'll proceed to a vote if the gentleman wishes.
Go voice vote.
Let's voice vote. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Opposed, no. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Let me ask for unanimous consent for a clarification that the text of the substitute amendment that is pending be the draft that was circulated last night. So what is further agreed to will be offered as an amendment, I understand, by Mr. Borton. So the text that is under consideration by unanimous consent would be the text of the bill that members received last night, and that will be the text.
We have no objection to that, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, that'll be the order. Further amendments? Are we ready with your amendment? Mr. Barton, do you have?
Mr. Chairman, I have two more amendments, or do you want to, when you want?
Let's go to Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate
You have an amendment
your
at the
help.
desk?
Yes, I have
Clerk will
Amendment 39 at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5626 offered by Ms. Harmon of California, Mr. Dole of Pennsylvania, Mr. Welch of Vermont, and Ms. Baldwin of Wisconsin.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What this amendment would do is task the National Academy of Engineering to study for 1 year the economic, safety, and environmental impacts of requiring one or more relief wells to be drilled in tandem with the drilling of some or all of the wells covered by our legislation. As everyone can see, this is a study, and it includes a focus on the economic and other impacts of simultaneous drilling of relief wells, and it does not say that they would necessarily be drilled for all deep water wells. If we could roll back the videotape and think about how horrifying the BP spill has been, wouldn't it have been better to drill, or might it not have been better, to drill a relief well or one or more simultaneously with that deep water well? Obviously, we're all waiting anxiously for the completion of 2 relief wells, and it just seems to me that studying this issue and deciding based on the information in the study whether this idea makes sense is the right way to go. And finally, let me say, this idea was suggested to me by one of my constituents. Our constituents are very smart about this and have submitted hundreds recommendations, and this was one that certainly caught my attention, and I'm proud to offer it as an amendment to the bill or to the manager's amendment, and I urge adoption of this amendment.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I would just say that because of the agreement that we've reached tentatively with Mr. Waxman, Mr. Barton, that we discussed the amendments in advance, knowing that we have an agreement in principle here with the last amendment that we're going to do. We're prepared to accept this amendment. I'm not. I applaud you that it is a study, not a directive. At the hearing that we had several weeks ago, the comment was made either in a question that I asked or someone else, but during that discussion with the 5 companies, it was made apparent to me that in fact if you mandated such, especially if you didn't have a study, you could actually perhaps double the risk, which is not something that any of us would have wanted to see with any of these. But because it's a study, because it'll get done, we'll be able to evaluate at some point down the road whether or not this ought to be something that actually occurs. We don't have objection specifically on our side, though some members may not like it, but we're prepared to accept it as part of the bill.
Reclaiming my time, I thank the gentleman. He and I have collaborated on many amendments in this committee, and yes, it is a study, and if it reveals that there are problems with this approach, then we shouldn't go forward with it. But I do appreciate the bipartisanship, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Gentleman from Alabama, recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And a response to the suggestion of the gentlelady from California. Does any other country require a ancillary well? Norway or the United Kingdom, who are thought to have the most safest, the most safe
Well, the gentleman,
rules and regs?
if the gentlelady
No,
would
he
yield
has
to
the-
me,
he has the time.
or if the gentleman yield to me.
Gentleman from Alabama.
I'll be happy to.
Canada does
Yeah.
require. There, I don't know about offshore, but there may not be any. But onshore Canada, there is a requirement that as you drill the primary well, you also drill a relief well, concurrent.
Yeah.
In the deep water, drilling.
I'm not familiar with deep water in other countries.
Yeah.
Just a suggestion that any study that we might do, we may benefit from a study that maybe has already been done. I think that their standard of excellence for safety has been exemplary in Norway and in the United Kingdom. So I appreciate the suggestion. It is certainly something that should be studied.
Would the gentleman yield to me?
Yes, I would.
I would hope, and I'm just suggest this, that the legislative history on this bill urge the National Academy to study the experience of other countries.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Any further discussion on the amendment? All those of... Yes, Mr. Markey. Oh. I'm sorry. Okay. All those in favor of the Harmon amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's adopted. Mr. McNerney, you have an amendment, as I understand it, at the desk.
Thank you,
prepared to
Mr.
offer
Chairman.
it?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5626, offered by Mr. McNerney of California. Strike
Without
black-
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering a straightforward amendment to improve Section 6 of the Blowout Prevention Act, which authorizes the creation of expert review panels to provide technical advice on regulatory decisions. My amendment simply clarifies that experts serving on such panels can be drawn from diverse backgrounds, including industry, national laboratories, and academia. I would like to note the particular importance of utilizing the expertise at America's national laboratories. I'm familiar with the work of the labs and the talents of the lab employees through my personal experience working as a contractor at Sandia National Laboratories. Northern California is the location of 3 national laboratories that employ a number of my constituents. The national laboratories employ some of America's leading scientists, engineers, and technology experts, and they have already contributed significantly to the recovery efforts in the Gulf. Following the tragic explosion of the Deepwater Horizon, employees of the national laboratories were quickly deployed to the Gulf. The Department of Energy estimates that more than 200 lab employees have been involved in the crisis response operations. The labs have provided an array of services directly related to the legislation we are considering today, such as developing pressure measurements and radiographic imaging of the blowout preventer. Lab employees have also monitored and assisted BP's response efforts, providing necessary technical service such as conducting flow and resistance calculations, evaluating pressure data, and providing independent analysis of BP's plans. Our country has been dependent on BP to develop spill response plans in the Gulf, but BP failed in its obligation to develop real plans to control a massive oil spill. The Gulf Coast residents are suffering as a consequence. As we develop a regulatory framework to prevent a future disaster, it's essential to benefit from the expertise of independent experts. I believe that the national lab employees, as well as their colleagues in industry and academia, offer the technical firepower that would serve the expert review panels well. Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure that this store of great technical talent is actually utilized in preventing avoidable tragedies like the Gulf spill in the future. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Any further discussion of the amendment? As I understand it, this is an amendment that has been agreed to, and I hope my colleagues would adopt this amendment. We'll now proceed to a vote on the McNerney amendment. All those in favor of that amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Mr. Stupak, you have...
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have amendment number 138 at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5626, offered by Mr. Stupak of Michigan.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is what we call our bad actor amendment. As we saw in Oversight Investigation Subcommittee on hearings we held into Deepwater Horizon and into British Petroleum's numerous safety violations, if you go back and look at the record starting in 2005, BP Texas City refinery explosion resulted in death of 15 people and 170 workers injured. As a result of that accident and BP's failure to correct potential hazards faced by the employees at Texas City, OSHA has twice slapped BP with record-setting fines totaling more than $100 million. In March of 2006, BP discovered its pipeline on Alaska's North Slope had spilled more than 200,000 gallons of oil on the tundra, making it the largest spill in North Slope history. On September 29, 2008, a high-pressure gas line separated, sending 3 pieces of pipe from the Alaskan pipeline onto the tundra. 30 minutes later, a second and unrelated incident occurred where there was a gas release. In addition to these pipeline incidents, there have been several personal injury accidents where employees have been seriously injured or killed, as was the tragic case of Mike Phelan on November 18, 2009, when he was crushed between the pipeline and a truck. This is just a short summary of the incidents that occurred at BP operations. The trend has continued to this day. A report from the Centers for Public Integrity showed that in the past 3 years, BP refineries in Ohio and Texas have accounted for 97% of the egregious and willful violations handed out by OSHA. OSHA statistics show BP ran up 760 egregious willful safety violations, while during that same period of time, Sunoco and ConocoPhillips had 8, Citgo had 2, Exxon had 1. Companies that operate with willful disregard for the safety of their workers and no concern for environmental disasters should not be allowed to continue to receive drilling permits for deepwater wells that are inherently risky. My amendment is modeled after an amendment that was passed yesterday in the Natural Resources Committee. It was authored by George Miller. We'd worked on this together, and what it does is we prevent inherently bad actors in the drilling industry from being awarded federal permits. The amendment would strengthen federal regulations on the oil industry by preventing any company that has willfully violated OSHA standards, allowed the death of 10 employees due to unsafe work conditions, or severely violate federal environmental standards from being allowed to receive federal drilling permits for high-risk wells. If this amendment had been in place prior to Deepwater Horizon spill, it would have granted federal regulators the authority to prohibit BP from conducting drilling at deepwater leases and prevented this disaster before it happened. I'd urge the committee to adopt this resolution. Basically, on these leases of lands that we see in the outer continental shelf, no matter what my record is as a company, if I have 760 violations, when most of them have less than 8, even though I'm a bad actor and a willful disregard for life and safety in our environment, as long as I pay my money, I'm entitled to get my permit. And we have to have some discretion here, somewhere to say you can't continue to violate the law, put your workers at safety, and still be allowed the right to drill or extract minerals in these continental United States. So I'd ask for support of this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Mr. Barton, you seek recognition?
I do, in opposition to this.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, Mr. Chairman, I'm not opposed to the gentleman's intent. He mentioned the BP pipeline spill in Alaska. That occurred when I was chairman of this committee. I helped conduct the investigation into that. I helped draft the legislation to change federal law, giving the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, under certain conditions, more regulatory authority in state issues, which that had previously been. We conducted a vigorous investigation. Mr. Stupak was involved with that investigation. Federal law was changed. We worked with the states to remedy that particular problem. I would also concur in Mr. Stupak's attestation that the current company, BP, does have a history of repeated safety violations. He mentioned one. There was also the accident at a refinery in Texas, and of course the accident that we're now involved with, Deepwater Horizon drilling rig off the coast of Louisiana. So there is certainly a case to be made that at some point in time certain bad actors should be prevented. Having said that, the nature of the bill before us, with all the new requirements, new certifications, third-party review, blowout prevention review, increased civil and criminal penalties, all are moves in the direction, if not quite as extensive as what Mr. Stupak's amendment would result in, certainly in the right direction and with the same intended consequences. What we want, Mr. Chairman, on both sides of the aisle and everybody in the country is a drilling program that is safe, that protects the environment, but that also gives an opportunity to find the natural resources in terms of energy that our economy and our country depends upon. The base text with the amendment that's going to be offered in terms of a manager's amendment, in my opinion, would actually increase safety, increase environmental protection, but it would also allow continued OCS activity to occur and would protect the rights of states onshore to regulate their oil and gas activity. So this particular Stupak amendment, in my opinion, is too aggressive and, again, would probably have the effect of preventing a fair amount of drilling activity, period, which would not, in my opinion, be in the long-term best interest of the country, because we'd have less domestic energy production, which means we would have to import more foreign production. So, again, A+ for intent, but I cannot accept it in terms of what would be the probable effect, and so would, with respect, oppose the amendment.
Would gentlemen yield?
Yes, be happy to.
And I agree. And when you were chairman and we worked together on O&I and all these investigations, we've worked together and you've been very cooperative. We always get to the bottom of it. Seems like it's always a oil company cutting corners, and that's why an accident happens. As you cut corners, you cut back on safety, you cut back on maintenance, and when you do that, disasters occur. But the issue I'm sure we've all been asked, every member has been asked, is why do you continue to allow them to drill when they have all these violations? I mean, we saw the oil response plans. If you didn't know, well, they said they could handle 250,000 spill. We had no way to doubt that. All these things we put in this legislation, this proposed bill that we're doing today, that's all great if it's all enforced. But it doesn't prevent this culture that BP has of cutting costs, taking risks, accepting noncompliance, and having all these problems. So when they say, why do you continue to let them? They have 760 violations, and the next one during the same period of time only has 8. The honest answer is because they had the money, and they put the money up, and they got the right to drill. Just putting money up to give you the right to drill can't be the answer anymore. We have some responsibility to say to the American citizens, if you're a bad corporation, you're killing people, polluting our lands, you don't get to do business in this country. We have to give someone that right. Because what's going to happen, we're going to get grilled next week. We'll grill the Department of Interior when they come in. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Because on paper, it all looked fine.
Well,
but we know the culture of that.
Reclaiming the last 17 seconds of my time, I agree with the gentleman about the history of this particular company, BP. I agree that they have not shown, in my opinion, the appropriate level of concern about safety and environmental protection. I agree with that. I'm sure the gentleman has looked at the base text that we're about to vote on. We're changing federal law because of that. The CEO of a company under this bill, if it becomes law, has to attest in writing, and the appropriate federal official has to determine that that attestation is in fact correct, that 1, the well design is safe, that 2, there is a blowout preventer that has redundant safety systems, that 3, there is an actual oil spill response plan that would work, and it would work promptly, and 4, that the applicant has the capability to begin drilling a relief well promptly and complete such a drilling of a relief well expeditiously. Those are new requirements that are not in current law. So we are trying to take a problem that has cost 11 people their life, that has caused billions of dollars in economic damages, an indeterminate but significant amount of environmental damage, and prevent it from ever happening again. But as we do that, we do have a bipartisan goal of allowing continued development of our energy resources in the Outer Continental Shelf. This bill intends to strike that delicate balance to be as aggressive as is possible to prevent this from ever happening again, but at the same time to allow reasonable, rational development to occur. The requirements in this bill are tough. The requirements in this bill are non-trivial. The requirements in this bill, if implemented correctly with good faith both by the private sector and the public sector, will materially improve safety and environmental protection and materially increase the probability that never again will this committee or this Congress or the President of the United States have to deal with a disaster on the proportion that we're having now in the Gulf of Mexico. So again, the gentleman's amendment is well-intentioned, but it moves the balance point, in this member's opinion, too far towards making it impossible to actually conduct a responsible drilling program. So I would continue to oppose it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is there further debate on this amendment? If not, let's proceed to a vote. All those in favor of the pending amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The chair now recognizes Congressman Scalise for an amendment. Are you prepared to offer your amendment, Mr. Scalise?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Scalise. 1, amend section 1710 as follows.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And this is the amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute that we're working on, and obviously we've been working on a number of differences on the legislation. Still would like to keep the discussion going about shallow water drilling, but I know when one of the disputes that we had was over onshore drilling, and especially as it relates to states' rights to regulate. And for states like Louisiana, Texas, others who have a long, extensive history of regulating onshore oil and gas production, I don't think that that right should be diminished, and I think those states should be able to maintain that right. The Macondo well was not a state-regulated well. It was in federal waters, and our state for sure has done, I think, a very good job of regulating, and we want to make sure in this amendment it maintains that those states that do regulate onshore oil and gas exploration and production will continue to be able to have that jurisdiction. And
Gentlemen, yield to me.
be happy to yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for this amendment. This amendment has a number of significant changes which has come about from over the gentleman, having yielded to me, I want to speak in support of the amendment. I thought this was going to be the bigger amendment, but this is a smaller one, which we've agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
And
Are we on 1710? The one that they read was 1710, which was the one I just described.
yes, and so the misunderstanding was mine, but I do want to express my support for it, and then you will offer after this amendment the larger compromise that we have for the
correct. So
legislation.
you prefer me to talk about the...
No,
shorter.
you're doing 2 amendments. We'll take this one up first.
Okay.
Any further debate on it?
Mr. Chairman,
Who seeks recognition?
is this 1710 we're looking at now?
Yes.
Okay.
Are we ready for the vote? All those in... And is that what's pending? Okay. I see. So the gentleman said we might as well take up what's been passed out, which is the compromise amendment. So the compromise amendment in its broader perspective, I mean, in its full perspective, is now before us. Is that what the gentleman purports?
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Whatever the
Well,
chair decides is the one I'd be happy to take up.
Okay. Well, the chair would like to recognize himself on this amendment. This amendment now embodies the changes that have been agreed to after several weeks of negotiations on a bipartisan basis, and I think we produced a very good bipartisan product. This amendment has a number of parts to it. One of the issues that was under discussion was the scope of coverage, and this amendment replaces the definition of high-risk well with a narrower definition of covered well. This addressed concerns that had been raised by several members that federal regulation should not apply to onshore wells currently subject to effective state regulation or to marginal wells, and that federal regulation may not be necessary for offshore wells within state boundaries. The amendment also refines and clarifies the minimum regulatory requirements relating to blowout preventers, well design, and cementing, as well as the basic conditions which the CEO of an applicant must attest are met, and the appropriate federal official must determine are met before a federal permit to drill a covered well is issued. It clarifies the authority of the appropriate federal official to substitute a more effective technology or practice for a minimum requirement established by the Act. The amendment modifies the definition of appropriate federal official to limit the potential designees to the Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of the Interior. It also modifies the citizen suit provision to align it with current law. I've described the most significant changes, but this amendment includes a number of additional technical and clarifying changes. This has been negotiated, and what the gentleman from Louisiana discussed in his opening statement was a more narrow issue incorporated within this one, or if not incorporated with this one, will soon be incorporated within this amendment to fulfill the agreement that we have reached. I certainly urge all members to support this amendment, and I want to yield to Mr. Barton from Texas.
I thank the chairman. I want to support the broader amendment that has been presented and want to make a procedural point and then a policy point. On procedure, it shows that Congress and this committee can work when there's good faith effort on both sides at the member level and the staff level. The staffs of the members involved and the committee staffs worked in good faith, narrowed it to a set of issues that the members had to become involved in. The members became involved, and in a good faith effort on both sides, with an open debate, came up with conceptual language that was then clarified into what's before us. The end result is going to be, if this bill becomes law, and I hope it does, new regulatory authority by the federal government to, in the offshore and in some cases onshore, make sure that every well that's drilled in the United States is drilled as safely and as environmentally protectively as possible. But at the same time, a compromise has been struck that guarantees the state oversight in areas that states have traditionally exercised their regulatory authority unless a finding is made that the state has failed in its duty. And the burden of proof in this amendment is such that states will have every opportunity on an expedited basis in federal court to show why they do not feel that the state has failed that test. So for those that think we need to have more regulatory certainty or regulatory enforcement, this is something that members can vote for in good faith. For those that believe, especially in the onshore, the states have exercised their regulatory authority effectively, they can vote for this amendment in good faith because it protects that. So in my opinion, Mr. Chairman, this is the committee at its finest. And I believe the Congress at its finest. So I support it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. Let me say that this amendment is a product of input from all of our colleagues who have raised concerns about the original bill that was introduced, but specifically I want to single out the participation of Mr. Melanson and Mr. Green, Mr. Upton and Mr. Markey, of course, Mr. Barton and Mr. Scalise. All of us worked in good faith, discussed these amendments, discussed not the amendments as such, but what ought to go into an amendment that would bridge the differences that we had so that we could all support what we feel is a good, solid, bipartisan bill that will meet the concerns that have been foisted to our attention because of what has happened in the Gulf and the BP incident. Any other members wish to be recognized? Mr. Markey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. The Scalise amendment before us today kind of embodies the bipartisan way in which we have worked on these issues. This committee, because of its jurisdiction over energy exploration and production, has a responsibility to address the critical issue of responding to the implications of the catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico. And as the chairman said, and the ranking member said, we have worked very closely with Mr. Barton with Mr. Upton, with Mr. Melanson and Green, and with Mr. Scalise, the maker of this amendment, over the last couple of weeks and continuing right through this morning. The chairman worked very hard right from the very beginning to ensure that this was a bipartisan process, and I want to congratulate him and compliment him on this final product, because it does reflect the spirit that he instilled into this discussion right from the very beginning. Historically, regulation of offshore drilling has required the use of best available, safest technologies, taking costs into account. But regulators have had little or no congressional guidance on what this standard requires, and current regulations plainly are not adequate. The BP Act responds to this gap by establishing minimum standards for well drilling, technologies, and practices for outer continental shelf and other covered wells. The legislation is built on the basic concept of defense in depth. It requires multiple lines of defense against a blowout, and it ensures that these defenses are redundant so that failure of one does not lead to cascading failures of the entire system, as occurred with BP's Macondo well. First, the legislation sets minimum standards for blowout preventers, the last line of defense against a blowout like the one that occurred at the Macondo well. The legislation also requires new standards on safe well design and cementing to ensure multiple redundant barriers within the well against uncontrolled oil or gas flow that could lead to a blowout. The BP Act also includes provisions to strengthen regulatory oversight to ensure that safety standards keep pace with advances in technology. The bill requires periodic updating of regulatory standards and establishes an independent technical advisory committee. The legislation also requires independent third-party certification of blowout preventers and well designs, and establishes whistleblower protections for rig workers. And finally, it requires periodic and unannounced inspections and establishes strict civil and criminal penalties. One of the critical questions in developing the legislation has been the scope of the coverage. We have reached a bipartisan consensus on that issue. The requirements of the Act will apply to all wells on the outer continental shelf. Outside the outer continental shelf, the requirements apply if two criteria are met. First, there has to be a determination that a blowout from such a well would cause extensive and widespread harm to public health and safety or the environment. And second, the federal regulator would have to determine that the state in which the well is located can't effectively ensure safety at the well. So long as a state's regulatory regime can provide a comparable level of safety, the well would not be subject to federal regulation under this Act. Which brings us to the Scalise Amendment. The Scalise Amendment ensures that for onshore wells, the federal government cannot step in to regulate unless there is clear and convincing evidence that state regulation cannot effectively protect public health and safety and the environment. Any federal finding that state regulation of high-risk onshore wells is ineffective would be subject to expedited review by the courts. The federal finding of the effectiveness wouldn't take effect unless the federal government prevailed in the court proceeding, including any appeals. So that is the heart of this Scalise agreement that embodies the conversations that the chairman had with Mr. Barton, with Mr. Upton, along with Mr. Green and Mr. Melanson and Mr. Scalise. We think it does strike a good balance, and we thank all of the members for working closely in order to achieve this final goal. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Further discussion to clarify the procedural situation that we're in. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that that the two Scalise amendments be considered in block. Without objection, that'll be the order. The vote now comes on the Scalise amendments in block. All those in favor of the Scalise amendments will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Vote now comes on the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended.
Mr. Chairman,
Dingle, for what
is it
purpose do you seek
too late to
amendment?
ask a few questions of staff on this matter?
The chair would state that it's never too late if the gentleman from Michigan wishes to ask questions. I recognize you for 5 minutes.
These are not hostile questions, Mr. Chairman. So with your recognition, can I have the attention of the staff? There are two concerns which I think are addressed in the bill, but I want to be very sure they're adequately addressed. The first concern is that the government does not have an adequate capability at this time of requiring a proper plan that can be implemented to clean up a spill or some kind of misadventure if such occurs. I believe that the bill in its parts, as I have read it, provides that the government not only has the power to do this, but has the duty to do this under the legislation. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, Section 2A lays out several requirements that a CEO of an applicant for a permit to drill must attest to, and that the appropriate federal official must find. One of those provisions is number 3, that the applicant has an oil spill response plan that ensures that the applicant has the capacity to promptly control and stop a blowout in the event the blowout preventer and other well control measures fail.
So the government has the ability to impose under the statute the requirement that a fully implementable and adequate plan is in its hands from the licensee. Is that right?
In order for a federal permit to drill to be issued, that would have to be the case.
Okay. And you're satisfied that's adequate to assure that the plan does meet the needs and the concerns of properly assuring that the party getting the lease has an adequate responsibility to do this?
The oil spill response plan would have to ensure that the applicant has the capacity to promptly control and stop a blowout.
I'm going to assume that you're telling me yes. Now, what about the government? Does the government have to have a plan of this kind also, or not?
I'm not aware of a specific requirement in the amendment of a nature of a substitute for the government to have its own plan.
Well, isn't that a weakness? If the government doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have a plan of its own, I'm concerned. You got the permittee going to have a plan, but I think one of the plain things here is the government had no clear responsibility to check the plans by the permittee, and it had literally no plans or ability on its own part to address this question. That's current law. You're telling me that you have addressed in the bill half of this. I'm not hearing the other half is addressed. Am I right or wrong?
If the gentleman would yield.
I'll yield to anybody if they can answer me.
Right down here, John. That part of the plan, that is the government's response, is within the jurisdiction of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and they are addressing that part of the problem in the legislation which they are producing as part of this.
So you're telling me another committee is addressing this?
That they are the committee of jurisdiction over that part of this
My
problem.
experience with other committees is that you're asking me to trust an awful lot here. All right, now, I'll assume we're going to trust him. Now, what about this situation, which became very clear during the hearings and the inquiries that we had on this? It becomes rather clear to me, from what I observed, that there was this great bowing and scraping between the government and the permittee, or the leaseholder, as to who had the responsibility of dealing with it. And we saw this in the case of the Exxon Valdez, we saw it in connection with other spills. And so you had a goodly period of time where everybody's trying to figure out who is going to be in charge. Who is in charge of doing the cleanup, and how is it enforced by the government so that you have them getting on it right away instead of going 70 or 80 days into this thing as we have at this particular time? I'm listening to counsel, and my time is running out.
There is no specific provision of the amendment of the nature of a substitute that addresses that issue.
So what we do is sort of guess who's going to be responsible on this matter? I'm not sure I want to be guessing on these kinds of matters. Who's going to, if the permittee or the leaseholder doesn't have the responsibility to do it, what's the government going to do about this? And what power does the government have to grab him by the throat and say, fella, get busy. You have this to do. And if you don't, we will proceed to do it. But then you've got a government which doesn't have the tools, the authority, or the personnel. So the question then is, how does the government do this thing?
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield if the gentleman can help me.
I thank the gentleman. Those decisions are controlled by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which is within the jurisdiction of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. The fact that I note that it is within another committee's jurisdiction does not mean that in any way I am expressing any happiness with that fact or any endorsement of any solutions that they might come up with. It's only an expression of the jurisdiction of that committee. And I will note, for the purpose of this discussion, that the gentleman from Michigan jealously guarded the transportation jurisdiction of this committee in a way that would rival any in the history of the United States Congress. And I know that he did not participate in any way in 1995 in the ceding of our committee's jurisdiction to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. But that is unfortunately something.
Gentlemen, permit, the time has expired, but without objection, I'd like to have another minute yielded to the gentleman from Michigan.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just note one thing here that I think is important. I've heard it said that the government response plans are required under OPA 90. These are very complex plans. They're developed in all regions of the country to serve this purpose. Am I correct in assuming that those plans would give the government the authority to address the concerns that I'm expressing about who's going to be in charge in the event that there's an event requiring a cleanup or caused by a blowout or some other unfortunate kind of event of that sort?
If the gentleman would yield?
I'll be happy to yield to my friend.
It is my understanding that that is what Mr. Oberstar's intention is, and that will be included in his legislation, yes.
Well, I would ask this, and I just asked my two good friends, the chairman of the subcommittee and the chairman of the committee, if they'd work with me to kind of comfort me on this distress that I feel about the responsibilities of the leasee or the permittee, and also the responsibilities of the government. And if they'll work with me, I'll be happy to try to work with them and hope that we can be sure that we're all a little more comfortable on these points than we are at this time. And Mr. Chairman, you've been most gracious. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Certainly, Mr. Markey and I and Mr. Barton and Mr. Upton will be glad to review this issue with you because it is of great concern to all of us. The vote now comes on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended.
Is this the final passage?
No, that would be the next one. All those in favor of that amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment's agreed to. Now we will vote on ordering H.R. 5626 as amended with the recommendation that the bill do pass. And
Mr. Chair. Mr. Inslee down here.
Mr. Inslee?
Maybe I heard just briefly on a moment on final passage. Just a moment.
Well, without objection.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I wanted to, there was an amendment we were not able to offer in the spirit of bipartisanship. And I do want to say something that I hope we continue to work on an effort to make this industry as good as the aviation industry when it comes to safety. And the aviation industry has adopted a concept of quantified risk analysis, of requiring the relevant industry to quantify the risk and require them to do engineering to meet that level of quantified risk. It is an idea I hope we can continue to work on to succeed at some point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now we'll proceed to a roll call vote on final passage of the bill. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, aye. Ms. Jakowski. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck passes. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Okay. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, Aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson? Aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, aye. Sorry. Mr. Braley?
Aye.
Mr. Braley, aye.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote and report it. Before you tally the vote,
Ms. Schakowsky votes aye.
clerk ready to report, please tell us the vote.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 48, 1 pass.
48 aye. And
0 no, 1 voting pass.
Okay. 48 votes aye, none against, 1 member has passed. The chair declares that the bill is reported. And that fulfills the schedule for today. We stand adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, we recessed? I was just going to thank the chairman, but also encourage the chairman, if possible, our leadership would run this bill separately from the other bills if we could make that case.
Congratulations.